In this video, I want to dig into our quiz platform here, and specifically, I want to build this quizzes page. So I want to build a page where we can pull all of the quizzes that are in our database and list them out in these little preview cards that will allow the user to then choose one to play, and then they'd end up on the play quiz route. So we're going to set up a number of things in our project. I have a set of starter files here that you can start from, or I'll do a quick tour here to tell you what has changed from the last time. So you can work in your own files and just make the quick changes, or pull in the individual files from the starter files that I'll have linked if you want to go that route. So, a couple of things. I've trimmed away some pages that we had in here that we no longer need. So there's no longer an about page here. There's no about route. So our application, if we check out this, is actually a much trimmed down version, which will allow us to add back in new routes, but add in these new routes that we're going to be creating here in our diagram. So about is gone. There used to be a visualization page that's been removed. And I've also added in a 404 page. So with your routes, if you match anything with a wildcard here and you put it at the end of your list of routes in your switch, this will catch anything that doesn't match any of these routes. So if I were to go to /game, it's going to go to that 404 page, which is a really simple page that just tells the user, hey, there's nothing here at this route. And that is a simple React component that uses the location hook from React Router to get access to the path name so that we can put that on the page. So new 404 added, old routes removed, and then there are a couple of style changes in the index.css to just restyle the buttons for our preview page. And I have also added in two new folders here. So there's a quizzes page route here. So there's a page and then a couple of supporting components here that are going to be useful for when we try to list things out. So there's just a little bit of scaffold for us to run with. And we'll talk about that more as we dig into building out this page. So it just has some styles and some placeholder components. And then I've also added into my data folder here a sample data folder that has a couple of sample quizzes that have been structured according to the diagram that I put up on the whiteboard here. So just a couple of example quizzes that we can load up into our database really easily. So they've got title and description and difficulty and tags and a timestamp for when they were created and modified, and a fake owner ID and a fake owner name and a bunch of questions. So there's one here for beginner JavaScript that has a document ID and then an object of all of the data that should be in that document. Same structure for the music quiz and same structure for the video games quiz here. So what this sample data folder does is expose this load sample data method that just runs through all of those quizzes that I've created in that folder, pulls out the ID and data, and then drops them into a collection called quizzes in our Firebase database using that ID and using that data. So this is a really placeholder way for us to inject data into our application. It's okay for us to do when we're doing active development, but don't do this in a production application how we're doing it here, because here I would be overriding potentially data that might exist under that ID. There's probably nothing under the IDs that I've put in here, but there could be. So you don't want to override data that's already in your application. So we can use this if we head back to our index.js and we have our Firebase credentials properly stored, and then I go ahead and the import is not pulling up here. So I'm going to open up load sample data and try and get that. There we go. I have found that if you have the files open, that the IntelliSense is more able in a vanilla JavaScript file to find those imports. So I just brought that in, call this function, and what it's going to do, since I'm putting this in index.js, is as soon as I load that page, it's going to try and run that function that jams those quizzes into our database. So if I pull up my Firestore, and whoops, I think it already inserted them, I'm going to go ahead and delete this collection. So that's gone. All I have is my users from that time that we were playing around with users. If I refresh my application and then come back here, we should see those quizzes have been injected here. And they've been injected under those IDs with that dump of data in them. So we have a couple of quizzes that when we go to list things, we will actually see in our application. And you'll also see that in the console, there are a couple of console messages that come from that function. So once you've got your sample data loaded in your application, you can just go ahead and delete that, comment that out so that you're not overriding that data every time your application loads. But that also means that we are free to manipulate this data in our database. So if we decided we wanted to make some tweaks or we wanted to delete a quiz and see what happens, we can always come back and rerun this once to get that sample data in there. This, like I'm saying, is kind of like a janky way to do things. There's a local development tool that we just don't have time to dig into right now that would be a better way to inject data into a test database, but this will work for getting something into a live database for our purposes. Okay, enough with the tour of the starter files. We have enough now to actually dig into trying to build this quiz application. And specifically, we just want to build the quiz listing in this video. So getting started, what I want to do is add in our app here. This is our app component. I want to add a route for the quizzes. So I'm going to come in here and create a route. And the path is /quizzes. And onto that route, I want to put the quizzes page here. So let's see if this pops up in IntelliSense. It does not. So I'm going to cheat, make it recognize that, and then come back and try typing it. There we go. Okay, so that did the auto import so that I didn't have to write this import. Obviously, you can just write that by hand if you're having trouble getting the IntelliSense to pick it up. So I'm importing that page. I'm putting it in here at the route of quizzes. Once we do that, we should be able to flip back to the browser and go to /quizzes. And our placeholder component is here that says find a quiz, spot for search, and then the results where our quiz cards should go. Let's make sure that we add this to our nav. So if we go back to the common folder and go to the page header, I've also stripped out some things from the nav. So there's no about here like we had before. And we can just go ahead and create another link that goes to quizzes. And if we flip back, we should now have our quiz route, our quizzes route, and our homepage route. So we can start working in the quizzes route. So in our quiz page, so I can close down a couple of these other things. And in our quizzes folder, so this is the route for /quizzes, or the components that are related to /quizzes. We're grouping things by feature with our folders here. I have a quizzes page, which is just the markup. It has a main element and then the structure of our page with the headers and content underneath each of these H2s here. So we're going to be doing most of our work in the quiz listing page. So we've got quiz listing, which is a UL, just a UL with a list item. There should be a bunch more added here, including like a loading spinner and an error message, and that's what we're going to build. And I'll also point out that there is a quiz preview, which is a component that takes in a quiz ID and quiz data and throws them in a formatted kind of card-like thing on the page. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, so working on the, I meant to go to the quiz listing page here. So working on this page, what we want to do is talk to our collection. So we've got this Firestore collection here called quizzes that has a bunch of data injected into it. So we want to talk to that collection. We want to ask for all of the documents, loop through them, put them on the page in some kind of list. So what I want to do is pull up the docs here just to remind you. We've gone through the docs a couple of times now. Over on the Firestore sidebar, you can head to read data, and there's a section for getting data and a section for listening for real-time updates. We're going to do the get data once method, and you can see in the sidebar over here a couple of different links to different sections. So if you want to get a document, that doesn't apply in this situation, we'd go there. We want to get multiple documents from a collection. So we can see that here you can get all the documents in a collection by talking to your database, asking for the collection by name, and then calling get. And then you get your asynchronous promise that will resolve with a snapshot or reject with an error. And eventually we can also add some filtering, like with the where clause, to our querying here to do the searching through our database. Like if we get a drop down where we want to let them choose easy difficulty, we could use something like this where clause. Okay, so with that, what we're going to be doing is using from our Firebase file here. Remember, we got our config here, we create our application, and then we export the database instance. So this is our interface to the Firestore database. So if we import that here, oops, head to the quiz listing. What we were just seeing is with our DB, and let's get IntelliSense to play nicely. There we go. Import our DB, and we say collection quizzes dot get. That gives us a promise that allows us to await it to get the snapshot of all of the documents that are in that collection. So we don't want to do this just here out in the top level of our component. That would be bad because every time the component renders, that would trigger a new request. What we want to do is do this operation inside of an asynchronous effect. So we want to create an effect that runs when the component mounts that we can do our fetching. And we also are going to need some state that we can store the result in. So let's build those pieces. So I'm going to create a piece of state called quizzes, and we're going to use state here. And this will be something that has a status and a snapshot and an error. So it's going to have fields for each of those things. Previously, we've done the is Boolean for telling you whether or not it's loading. Because in the user video, I mentioned that you could use a string flag for controlling this and storing more states. Like maybe it's not just loading or error or success, it's initializing or loading or error or success. You kind of want to then move from your Booleans to a structure that better represents those multiple states. So we're going to do something like that with a string flag here that'll be loading if it's loading, success if it's done, error if it has failed. Then we've got a spot for the snapshot and a spot for the error message. Now we can use effect, and I'm letting it auto import for me at the top. And when we do our asynchronous logic in a use effect, we can't make this function asynchronous that would break some of React's expectations about how the effect works and the unsubscribe works. What we want to do instead is create an async function here, and we'll call this fetch collection or get collection. And this is where we can do our database logic. And then at the end, we can say call get collection. And we'll add our dependency array, an empty array, to indicate that this effect should only run when the component mounts. So when the component mounts, we've got our initial state, and this should go off and then mutate that state depending on what happens when we try to get our quiz. And at this point, I'll also pause to just say, like with our user system, we wrote some code directly in a component, and then we refactored it out. And we're going to do that same process here. Ideally, we don't want our quiz listing component, which is just rendering the quizzes to the page, to have to know how to get those quizzes. So to have a tight coupling to talking to Firebase. We want to decouple those, and we'll use a custom hook for that. But it's fine to kind of map out your logic normally here, or to map out all your logic in one place and then split it up and refactor it later. Okay, so let's do this logic. And I'm going to go pretty fast here because we've done Firebase and we've done asynchronous stuff before. So we've got a try and a catch. And inside of our try, this we can await. And this returns to us a snapshot of all of the documents inside of our collection. So when this resolves, we can set our quizzes to be a status of success and a snapshot. We can just pass this variable into our snapshot field, and error would be null. Then we would do something similar for error, except that our snapshot is null and our error object gets filled in here. And then our status, we would define this as whatever string we want to use to indicate that something went wrong. I'm going to use the string error. And I also like to dump these errors directly to the console so that when I'm doing local development, I can see them, I can see the full message and understand what went wrong. So this is almost finished here. I think even though this component only fetches once, and it starts off in the right state with loading null error, I think it would be good for us to just future-proof things by, before we even start the try, let's force the status into loading, the snapshot to null, the error to null. So we're kind of resetting things before we run our asynchronous logic. So with this, we should be able to console log, quizzes dot status, and let's also print out the snapshot and error and see what we've got. So all three of these are going to print out every time this component re-renders. So, and a re-render is going to be triggered every time we do this set state to a new state. So if we flip back here, we've got loading, and then nothing in the snapshot, nothing in the error, loading, nothing in the snapshot, nothing in the error, and then success. And we get our snapshot back, which has the ability for us to check if it's empty. We can check for the documents via that property there. We can ask for how many docs are in there. So we'll be able to use that, loop over that, and put it into our page. We can also see this in a sometimes better way using the React Dev tools. So we can see our state here. And then if I leave this route and come back to it and check it out, well, okay, that went too fast for me to show you the status snapshot and error. So in this case, kind of the console is the better debugging tool because we can see those states printing out one at a time. Okay, so we have something working. Of course, we'll refactor it later, but let's actually get something printing out to the page. So if the quizzes.status is loading, and we got to make sure we type this exactly as we type there, then we can return a loading spinner. I don't know what is going on with me needing to open these files before IntelliSense will pick them up, but I'm going to open the loading spinner, and then I'm going to try getting this to pop back up. Okay, so if we are in that loading state, we'll return the loading spinner. If we are in the error state, then we will return the error message component. And we'll say something like, something went wrong. Please try again. And of course, this didn't pick it up again. So I'm going to just write this one out by hand. Import error message from common error message. And you'll notice that I'm not using else and else if here, because each of these returns, that means that the function is done and the rest of the code is unreachable. So I don't need to add the else for each of these conditions. And my final situation here, when I have data, doesn't need a condition around it. Okay, so we've got if we're loading, if there's an error, we'll see those two things, and then we'll have our return down here if it was successful, because that's our third condition, our sort of implicit third condition. So refresh it, and we can see very briefly, there's the loading spinner that shows up. There's a loading spinner that's showing up from kind of the login. And then there's the loading spinner down here that shows up when this page is loading. And you can see that it's specifically just down here because this thing that we're creating, this quiz listing, is the component down here. It's not this whole page. And we can also, rather than force an error from the API, the Firebase API, we could just come in here and change this status to error and put whatever we want in here, and we'll see that an error message shows up on the page. Okay, so we're cruising along here. We have our data from our database, and what we want to do is now look at this snapshot and figure out how to extract the data that we want from it. So we're definitely going to need the ID of the quiz and then all of the data from the quiz. And if we flip back to the docs here that we had open, we can see that the query snapshot that we have, you can use the for each to loop over it, or if we head to the API reference here, so we just saw that this is a query snapshot. The other way that you would figure out what it is if you went to your collection reference, which we were doing get on, you'd see that that returns a promise that resolves to a query snapshot. So then we could head to query snapshot and see, okay, so it tells us the size. This is lining up with what we saw in the console, empty, docs. So we can use those to extract information. So we'll probably use the docs property here, which tells us it gives us an array of query doc snapshots. So I'm going to pop that open in a new tab here. And this is the thing that gives us the ID. So there's the property here for the ID. There's also a Boolean for whether or not it exists. And then there's a method called data, which is the thing that retrieves all the fields in that document as an object. Okay, so putting that together, if we reach this line of code, we know that we are in our success status because we're not in loading and we're not in error. So we can start using some of the properties of the snapshot. So I could say, let's grab the docs, which is quizzes.snapshot.docs. That's the array of all the documents. And what we could do is, instead of putting a list item on the page, we could say docs.map, and each of these things that we get back is a doc snapshot. So let's just put a list item that has the doc snapshot.id. And you can see that IntelliSense Prettier kicked in here and wrapped this in a parentheses so that it could span multiple lines. So I am accessing the docs from the snapshot, looping over them and turning them into list items. And if we flip back to the docs for our query document snapshot, you can see there's that ID property that I'm using. And we'll use the data method in a second. So here, if I flip back, I'm going to get a warning that I didn't put a key on my list items, which is fine, but I can see those IDs and we can check that they line up. So 1FU, 6F0, C1V, 1FU, 6F0, 6F0? Don't know which that is. And C1V. So it looks like it's mapping up. We've got the right IDs for what we've got in our database. So let's also grab the doc snapshot.data. That gives us the object that represents what's in our database. .title. So we'll grab the title field and see what's happening here. So we've got beginner JavaScript, musical quiz, video game knowledge. Excellent. So it's pulling our data, which is a JavaScript object of this, and then we're able to reach in and grab the title. And it's doing that for each of these. So we have our data pulled down and we have it hooked up to some markup here. What I want to do is pause the development and start moving this to a custom hook. We basically know that what we've got here is all database logic. Whoops, not that. All of this is our database logic. Quiz listing does not need to know any of these specifics about the database logic. It just needs to know the result. So the status, the snapshot, the error, and then it can take those and render them. And by moving this to a custom hook, we make our code more portable. So if quiz listing just needs to talk to a custom hook to grab these things, then it's easy for us later to say, oh, we don't want to use Firebase anymore. We're going to migrate to a different service. And we just have to update the logic in the custom hook without having to touch any of our rendering logic. So let's create a new hook in our hooks folder that is next to our Firebase file. So this is where we put our user login stuff before, and I'm going to create this and call it use quizzes once.js. So use quizzes once. I'm saying once here because with Firebase, you can real-time subscribe to your collection and get notified anytime something changes, or you can just ask for the data once. And that's the situation that we're in. We just want the data once when the component mounts. So we can call this a function, get quizzes once, and we can export that as the default. And back in our quiz listing, I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it in here. And I'm going to hit Control Space to bring in some of these imports that are missing. And make sure that at the end we are returning something. So we're going to return an object. And it's up to us, like we've done with our APIs for our hooks in the past, it's up to us to define what we want to return here. Do we just want to return this quiz state, or do we want to add some more information that makes it easier to handle? Or do we want to like transform our snapshot from the raw Firebase snapshot object to our own object that's easier for our components to manage? So I'm going to say that we're probably going to want to modify this. So what I'm going to do is destructure the status, the snapshot, and the error, and then drop them in here. And this will give us a good base for then refactoring things. Whoops. So that we can remove some of these things, replace them, or add new things to our return as need be. And why are you complaining here? So I think that something is wrong with the cached errors. Oh, nope. You know what I did? Well, this is a good thing to run into. Where would I see there? Down here. So if I look at the errors here, it's telling me that use state is used in a function that is not a hook or a component. And the reason why is we have to make sure that our hooks start with use. That's part of the linting rule and part of the convention in React land. So there we go. That's fixed. So we've got our hook. It stores the state, returns the state. We should be able to go back to our quiz listing here, delete, let's delete this, and then we're going to replace this with use quizzes once. And this is going to give us back a quizzes object that has the status snapshot error. So functionally, this should do the same thing. So refresh it. Does the same thing. We've got the key warning error that we'll fix shortly. We can remove this import up at the top because our quiz listing does not need to know about Firebase anymore. This is all happening in our custom hook. So let's look at this custom hook. Right now, this works. It's great. We've extracted some of the logic to a custom hook so that multiple components could use this hook. Multiple components could ask for all the quizzes in our platform, which is nice. But I don't really like what we're returning here. The status and error are fine, but the snapshot is a Firebase specific thing. So our components need to know that the ID is accessible as a property here, and data is a method that you have to call on the documents in that snapshot. What I would like to do is just return something that has the ID and document already for us to go. So instead of returning snapshot, let's create a results array. And we just want to do some parsing on the snapshot here to transform it into something that is more useful. And then we'll return that. So what we'll do is if there is a snapshot, so if we actually have something to work with, we've gotten our data back, then we can set our results equal to snapshot.docs. So remember, that is how we get the array of the document snapshots, and we can map that. So this will give us each snapshot one at a time that we can then transform and return into some transformed object. So we're going to take our snapshots and turn them into something more useful. We're still going to want the ID, which was docsnapshot.id. And then we'll grab the data and we will turn it into something that doesn't require the user to know that data is a method, because I find that that would be confusing if we were looking at an API and we didn't know that it was Firebase specific and that it had to do some calculation when it was running that. And that's why we were, that's why Firebase has designed it so that it's a method. I just want to be able to say .id and .data for my quiz and get those. So it's a small change, but it's one that we can make because we're now in a custom hook. So we can transform from the land of Firebase into our own API here. So we can return our results array. And in fact, we could add another thing here. We could calculate whether or not this is empty. and return that as well. So results.length. So remember, we're in complete control over the API of what gets returned here, and we can return an array, we can return an object, we can put whatever we want in here. What I want to do is kind of decouple our components from having to think about Firebase. So we can do transformations to get the data directly. So we're basically like pre-calculating the data here. And we can also add in whatever else we want, like a Boolean for whether or not there are any quizzes that have been found. So let's save that. And if we flip back to our quiz listing, we've changed the API here. So this will potentially break. We can get rid of this console logging. We still have the status of loading, the status of error. And now when we're mapping our documents, it is no longer docs. It's the array that we want is quiz.results. And in fact, we don't. This is pretty short, so we could just get rid of our docs variable and just directly say quiz.results.map. And this is now a quiz. And with that quiz, we can say .id and we can say .data without having to call the method. So if I pull these side by side for a second, this object here, what we transformed our snapshot docs or our doc snapshots to, that's what we're accessing here. So we're able to just say .id and .data. So this works just the same. Let's fix this key error. So here, let's add in the quiz.id. And that should go away. So we should probably also handle the situation where there's nothing in our database. And I can simulate that by, if we go back to use quizzes once here, and instead of asking for quizzes, I put in something that we don't have a collection for. What's going to happen is that it's going to return an empty array because there was nothing in that collection. So it would be nice, instead of not displaying anything here, we would display a message about there not being anything there. And that's where we can use our isEmpty Boolean. So now our hook, the object that we've got here, quizzes, that is returned by our hook, we can just say quizzes.isEmpty. And if it's empty, we'll return a paragraph that says no quizzes found. So this will say no quizzes found if there's nothing in that collection. And if I go ahead and take this back to our real collection name, our list is filled in. Okay, so we've got our data from the API here, from Firebase, from Firestore rather, and now let's just get this formatted on the page. So if we flip back here, there's one tweak we need to make in the quiz listing. Oh, and we can get rid of this import at the top. I've imported this CSS that is quiz listing CSS. It has one class in it for the list object that just removes the list styling. So we can throw that here. Class name is quiz listing. So now this is unstyled. And now we can, instead of putting a list item directly on the page, we can use the quiz preview component that I have pre-built. So this quiz preview component takes in an ID and data as properties, and then it just builds a little card that has the title and tags and owner name and description from the quiz all pulled out and put onto the page. So let's hook that up, and then we will talk about this structure a little bit. So quiz preview, and this needs the ID, so we'll pass that in. And it also wants to know the data, so we pass that in as an object. And this can be a self-closing attribute or element, and voila. So now we have these cards loading for each of the quizzes that have their description, their tags, their author, description, oh, I said description twice, and then a play button. And this play button currently doesn't work within our application. It'll take us to a 404 because we still need to build that route. But we have a functioning quiz listing page now in our application. So let's take a quick look at this component that we've got here for the quiz preview. And you can either grab this from the starter files or try building it yourself. This takes in the ID and data like we saw, and then it tries to pull out some of those fields from the data and then goes ahead and tries to put them on the page. And one thing that it does is try to code a little bit defensively. So it tries to assume that some of those fields might be missing. Maybe a user didn't add in a description, or we have some sample data in there that doesn't have an owner name, or maybe even like the owner was deleted from our application, like they were spamming our application. And so we removed them from the application. And so maybe that'll just default to be anonymous. So coding defensively can be kind of a tedious thing to do, but is not a bad idea in general, especially if you're working with an application that you're regularly deploying features to and regularly changing some of the data structure. It helps to code a little bit defensively to make sure that your application doesn't fall over if it talks to the wrong version of your database. So that's what's happening here. And then the rest is just some basic CSS. And if you're curious, you can dig into the CSS. It's just a few things to get a really simple card styling on the page that puts these different features of the quiz onto the page. And in the next video, we'll deal with, well, this link points to play quiz /ID. We better make a route that is play quiz ID. So this button won't work yet, but we will fix this very soon. So that is all that I want to do in this video. I do want to point out a few things before we wrap up. One is that what we're doing here, we haven't implemented searching or sorting, but that'll be easy for us to add later because we've already started moving these things into custom hooks. And what your use quizzes once can do is take in a parameter for how things should be filtered or sorted. So if we only want to show easy things, you could take a parameter in here for difficulty and then filter when you go do your query with a where to say where the difficulty equals whatever we were given. And then you would just make sure that this effect reruns whenever that changes. So we'll be able to do that in the future. One thing I also want to point out is this structure that we've written here. The only part of it that is specifically related to our quizzes is really just this line. Everything else that's in here is just general boilerplate for getting information from a collection. So if we were making an application that needed to talk to multiple collections, what I would actually do is write a use collection once that takes in a path to the collection or takes in a collection reference and then runs all of the logic on that collection. And then our use quizzes once would really just be returning the result of use collection once quizzes. And that would give us a structure so that if we add more collections to our application, this is reusable. Okay, so I'm not going to do that in this video. I'll leave that to you. If you're adding more than one collection to your application, it's a good process to do. What we've got currently will be enough for our purposes. And you could also think about, if you wanted to create a component that could listen in real time, you could create a similar set of components, or a similar set of hooks here that's like use quizzes real time, or use quizzes subscription, that gets the data and listens anytime there's a real-time change. And you can use the docs to kind of investigate that if you're interested in building it. Okay, so that's what this is the end of this video. We were able to build two components, or two pieces of logic. One was the rendering logic here, and I gave you some of the scaffolding, but we basically built something we built before that handles the different states that we're in, and we decoupled that from all of the Firebase logic, which we put into a custom hook. And this is a good practice, even though it's more difficult when you're starting out to think about separating out these pieces. It really does help make your application easier to maintain in the future. Because now if we decide we're moving from Firebase, nothing here needs to change. All we need to do is update this communication with the backend to talk to a different backend, and make sure that it maintains the same API that it returns, and then we're all good. Like, this component doesn't need to change. It's just our custom hook that changes. Okay, that's it for this video. The next one, we'll dive into getting that play page working.